To please welcome Kate Day up to the podium, and Kate will be speaking to us about partial removal of marine artificial structures, an ecological success or an invasive species disaster.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me today. I've chosen an intentional dramatic title just to grab your attention. I'm going to be talking to you about partial removal. This kind of also applies to just leaving all structures in the environment as well. I know that is considered an option sometimes. And I'm going to specifically talk to you about the risks in relation to invasive non-native species today. And just as backstory, I am a benthic ecologist. I'm also a non-native species person by trade. I sort of straddle those two quite nicely. You'll find in my talk, I talked today about the fact that a lot of invasive non-native species are benthic, so I think that wider understanding is quite useful. I'm going to start off by just making sure we're all on the same page as to what is a non-native species versus an invasive non-native species. I know a lot of you will know this, but it's worth going through. Non-native species are those that have been introduced outside of kind of their typical range, if you like, and they would have been introduced via some form of human-mediated method of spread, whether that's intentional or unintentional. And we call them invasive when they're problematic, essentially, and that might be impacts that are environmental, economic, or social, or all of those, if you're very unlucky. Some of the impacts that they have are they might compete for resources, so food and space with native species. They might spread disease to native species. Some of these can get really numerous in number. They might block intake pipes to power stations, vessels. They might block access to water bodies, so particularly when you've got kind of weeds blocking waterways that want to be used by recreation or fishers. Threatening tourism, potentially as well. Piles of seaweed are one of the pictures that you see piling up and making beaches inaccessible, and impacts on human health as well, potentially. In the UK, there was a study done trying to count the numbers of invasive non-native species. This is the ones that we know of. There's approximately 200, and around 40 odd of those are probably marine. Again, very much an estimate. And there will be many, many more non-native species that do not have negative impacts, so it's important to acknowledge. Most marine invasive non-native species arrive via shipping, so that might be on the hulls of ships, or that might be in ballast water, or through aquaculture as well, perhaps attached to shellfish, or the packaging or the water that comes with those shellfish as they're moved around. And they do cost the economy a lot of money per year. There was an estimate of about £4 billion per year, so we're talking a lot of money. And that is probably an underestimate considering that they would have been limited by the data that they had. And just a fun invasive non-native species to the right is the skeleton shrimp, Caprella mutica. In reality, that's about 5 centimetres. It looks a bit terrifying there, but just thought it'd be a nice image. Before I delve into the negative aspect, I really want to acknowledge, particularly with the talks today, about how exciting that this artificial reef concept is. They are great in many ways. They increase biodiversity, provide refuges for many species, potentially protect and support fish stocks, which can be also a bit of pain for the fishing community as well. But hopefully that spillover effect also is somewhat positive for them. And you know, all of this biomass attaching to these structures can potentially facilitate nutrient remediation and carbon capture and all sorts of exciting things. So I do want to acknowledge that. However, let's get back to invasive non-native species. They generally grow on hard surfaces. A lot of these species do, and that's got something to do with how they arrive. As I mentioned, a lot of them arrive on the hulls of ships, for example. So hard surfaces obviously includes marine artificial substrates, structures, and as sort of a bit backstory as well, many of them are intertidal. There's been some studies done trying to look at, you know, where are most invasive species on the structures when they're found. Actually, a lot of them are in that intertidal zone of the structure. You'll get some in the splash zone as well, and some in the subtidal. And the question I want to kind of ask today is, should we be factoring in this risk into when we're thinking about what we're going to do in terms of decommissioning? Do we do partial removal, full removal, etc.? Some of the current evidence that exists at the moment in terms of the studies that are out there, there was a study done that looked at the abundance in terms of both richness as well of non-native species on marine artificial structures. I think pilings they specifically looked at compared to natural rocky reef. And interestingly, they found sort of high abundance and richness on marine artificial structures. The paper was a bit more complicated than that, so I would recommend looking into it. I've got some sort of tiny references at the bottom, but if you would like me to share those, I'm very happy to do that with you. Examples of invasive non-native species that have been recorded on marine artificial structures in the North Sea include Coprolametica, so skeleton shrimp I showed you earlier, Darwin's barnacle, Ostraminus modestus, and you'll also see that a lot on the rocky shore, particularly in the UK. Pacific oyster, Chrysostria gigas, and Slipolipit, Crepidula fornicata, which is on the right-hand side of this screen. They can form these stacks and become very numerous and dominate the seabed, so they're more sort of subtidal problem. Globally as well, this is a problem. There is evidence of marine artificial structures supporting very high abundances of invasive species, and one relatively high-profile case is of the sun coral in Brazil, and this is more related to sort of oil and gas structures. You can kind of see over time the movement of the sun coral from where it's on the coast to the marine artificial structures offshore and then back and then up, and you can kind of see the time series of how its spread is essentially facilitated by the structures. So what are the key risks? Well, marine artificial structures can potentially increase habitat availability for invasive non-native species. And this is particularly true when you have areas that are naturally just perhaps muddy or sandy substrates. Maybe they don't actually have any rocky reef there at all, or no hard structures at all. So you're really changing the environment. You're introducing a new habitat potentially in these places. And the example that I mentioned for Brazil and the sun coral is kind of an example basically of stepping stone effect is what it's called. And I've acknowledged here on the slide that there is mixed evidence for this. And particularly offshore, it's a bit more complex because they're in these invasive species and everything else that's on the structures are kind of, if they're naturally from a coastal environment, they're being exposed to conditions that they're not necessarily adapted to. It might be colder, you've got deeper waters, you've got hydrodynamics, which will be a bit different to coastal waters. So there's lots to consider, and this is still an ongoing area of research. But I think considering these risks, I think we should be thinking about invasive non-native species, perhaps when we're considering what we're going to do at decommissioning. So despite the risks that I've sort of mentioned, I had a little dig around at sort of monitoring in relation to decommissioning, also in relation to construction as well. And this is more sort of oil and gas focused. So our team, our marine ecology team, do a lot of offshore wind work. Primarily, we have quite a broad portfolio though of other things, but this is a new area, so I'd be happy to discuss this with people. But my general understanding is that there is not much invasive non-native species specific monitoring that occurs to inform decommissioning approaches and also construction as well. And I couldn't find a huge amount of evidence that is consistently mentioned in any kind of environmental assessments related to those decommissioning options as well. So just to conclude then, I do think invasive non-native species risks, they do need to be factored into policy and practice, albeit we do need that balanced approach that I mentioned at the beginning about pros and cons, and that sort of context-specific approach. We need more monitoring to gain that evidence of, is anything there of concern? What should we do? If there are invasive non-native species present on the structures, we really need to think about, are we facilitating spread by leaving those structures there? Also, are there any invasive non-native species populations nearby of concern that could spread to those structures in the near future? So we need to be thinking about the now and the future as well. Some people have recommended that as a minimum, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of invasive non-native species are in that kind of intertidal zone. So perhaps as a minimum, we should be removing the top sections of the structures. And I think this is actually often done for many other reasons, not just this, but also, for navigational, reduce hazards in terms of navigation, but also because recycling is a really great thing to do and can also save money by doing that. So lots of motivation to do removal of the top sections. The risks are potentially higher in terms of invasive species spread in relation to this topic for more inshore coastal regions. As I mentioned, there's kind of that flow potentially of invasive populations from the coast to the structures, and it sort of comes back and forth, and they can extend the distribution. So maybe, and I'm just posing ideas here, we should be opting for more kind of full removal where those higher risk, potentially inshore areas. This is really harking back to the construction, really, is perhaps also considering where possible using natural materials. And this relates to the study I mentioned about sort of invasive non-native species seem to be particularly good at growing on those artificial substrates, and perhaps using more natural materials, particularly with scour protection, for example, might be the way to go where we can. And the final point is an idea that I've tried to find evidence for. It's a tricky one, makes a lot of ecological sense, I believe, where we're creating intentional artificial reefs, where we're maybe removing structures, cleaning them off, putting them back, or maybe other instances where we want to intentionally introduce those structures back into the environment or leave them. We might want to seed those structures. So what I mean by that is we might want to give the native species a head start where we can. I think I have seen evidence of this happening in terms of oyster restoration, where I think there's a bit of a preliminary study where they were literally gluing oysters to the structures and trying to see what happens. So there's a lot to be done, there's a lot of research, but really this discussion was to raise awareness and a bit of a call to action, really. So thank you very much for listening.